Today we are going to be reading from the book of 2 Maccabees. If you do not have a handout which has the scriptures, just raise your hand and Mike will bring one to you. So if you were to pretty much pick up your Bible, this is a New King James Version, and you were to flip through the Bible, you would be probably looking for a long time in order to find the books of the Maccabees. Does anybody know offhand how many books there are of the Maccabees? Right, 4 or 2. That's actually correct. Depends on how one divides it. But just for the sake of argument, we'll say that there's 4. And it's the history of our people. And so this particular version comes from the New Revised Standard Version, which most everybody's familiar with. You can find it online anywhere. Easy to find. So what I have done is I have pulled out 7 chapters and have portions of those chapters in which you have copies of it in front of you. I thought, should we put it up on the overhead? Should we just give everybody a copy? And I thought, let's just give everybody their own copy. And that way you can take it home, look through it and reread it. Maybe you even set it aside and keep it for next Hanukkah, in which you're able to have it on hand. Again, you can find it online and in a bookstore if you can find one near you. There's not that many anymore. Thank God for Amazon. Did I just say that over the air? Oh, well. Hopefully he'll forgive me. So what we're going to do is we have 7 readers, which are going to come up and we'll read a chapter each. So a little background just quickly. I'm sure many people have kind of done their research on it, but it's taken from a period in Israel's history. This is our history. If you are not born Jewish, but you have come to faith in Jesus, or Yeshua, as we like to say, you are grafted into Israel in a mysterious way. We like to say that Messiah's Israel is the intersection of Jews and Gentiles. If you can see that, it's not really big, but there's an intersection of Jews and Gentiles, and that little portion is what we call Messiah's Israel, often in some terms referred to as the church, but these are the believers, and only God knows who that is. So if you are not Jewish and you are a believer in Yeshua, in Jesus, then you are grafted into this covenant, this new covenant, which makes you a partaker of, and this is your family history too. Always like to emphasize that we're not reading ancient history about the Jews. This is your family history and my family history. Amen? Amen. So the history of this particular portion comes from the 2nd book of Maccabees, and it is a really hard time. Once again, Israel is being persecuted, has been invaded, and in this particular portion of the story, we are occupied by the Syro-Greeks. And there is a name that you'll read often in here, Antiochus Epiphanes, which roughly translates into, I am God, look at me. And so he is a type of something that's coming in the future. And I'll have a little short drasha after the reading of it. Jason, which you'll read in here, he was a Jewish priest who was... he was what was called the party of the Hellenizers, or the Hellenization. And that was the corruption of Jewish culture by the occupying Greek, which had this perspective that the human body, the human form, is sacred. All the Greek gods are in the image of man, and it's literally in the exact opposite of what God said. How are we created? In the image of God. Right, so they literally flip-flopped it into this, and so at that point, the Hellenization of Israel had started, and it was becoming this corruption. We could liken it to our times now, where our young people are being corrupted into the ways of the world. It's just simple like that, and that all comes from this spirit, this enemy who desires to kill, steal, and destroy. So read this story as we read it together, meditate on it, because it's happening now, and it's going to, in this portion that we'll read towards the end, actually pictures a coming time in the future. So we'll have a little bit more to say about that. What we're going to do is each of the readers knows what number reader you are and the chapter. So Mike's going to be the first reader. Just ask for the next reader, which is Roy, to kind of stand over here, and as Roy transitions up here and Mike sits down, that reader number 3 would kind of fill it, so we just kind of have a smooth flow. and I am going to be your microphone.
Okay, appreciate that. A letter to the Jews in Egypt. The Jews in Jerusalem and those in the land of Judea. To the Jewish kindred in Egypt, greetings and true peace. May God do good to you, and may he remember his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, his faithful servants. May he give you all a heart to worship him and to do his will with a strong heart and a willing spirit. May he open your heart to his law and his commandments, and may he bring peace. May he hear your prayers and be reconciled to you, and may he not forsake you in time of evil. We are now praying for you here. In the reign of Demetrius, in the 169th year, we Jews wrote to you in the critical distress that came upon us in those years after Jason and his company revolted from the Holy Land and the kingdom, and burned the gate and shed innocent blood. We prayed to the Lord and were heard, and we offered sacrifice and grain offering, and we lit the lamps and set out the loaves. And now you see that you keep the festival of booths in the month of Chislev, in the 188th year. And then a letter to Aristobulus. The people of Jerusalem and of Judea and the Senate and Judas, to Aristobulus, who is of the family of the anointed priest, teacher of King Ptolemy, and to the Jews in Egypt, greetings and good health. Having been saved by God out of grave dangers, we thank him greatly for taking our side against the king, for he drove out those who fought against the holy city. When the leader reached Persia with a force that seemed irresistible, they were cut to pieces in the temple of Neaea by a deception employed by the priest of the goddess Neaea. On the pretext of intending to marry her, Antiochus came to the place together with his friends to secure most of its treasures as a dowry. When the priest of the temple of Neaea had set out the treasures, and Antiochus had come with a few men inside the wall of the sacred precinct, they closed the temple as soon as he entered it. Opening a secret door in the ceiling, they threw stones and struck down the leader and his men. They dismembered them and cut off their heads and threw them to the people outside. Blessed in every way be our God, who has brought judgment on those who behaved impiously. Fire consumes Nehemiah's sacrifice. Since on the 25th day of Chislev, we shall celebrate the purification of the temple, we thought it necessary to notify you in order that you may also celebrate the festival of booths and the festival of fire given when Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. For when our ancestors were being led captive to Persia, the pious priests of that time took some of the fire of the altar and secretly hid it in the hollow of a dry cistern, where they took such precautions that the place was unknown to anyone. But after many years had passed, when it pleased God, Nehemiah, having been commissioned by the king of Persia, sent the descendants of the priests who had hidden the fire to get it. And when they reported to us that they had not found fire, but only a thick liquid, he ordered them to dip it out and bring it. When the materials for the sacrifices were presented, Nehemiah ordered the priests to sprinkle the liquid on the wood and on the things laid upon it. When this had been done, and some time had passed, and when the sun, which had been clouded over, shone out, a great fire blazed up, so all marveled. And while the sacrifice was being consumed, the priests offered prayer. The priests and every one. Jonathan led, and the rest responded. as did Nehemiah. The prayer was to this effect: O Lord, Lord God, creator of all things, you are awe-inspiring and strong and just and merciful. You alone are King and are kind. You alone are bountiful. You alone are just and almighty and eternal. You rescue Israel from every evil. You chose the ancestors and consecrated them. Accept this sacrifice on behalf of all your people Israel, and preserve your portion and make it holy. Gather together our scattered people. Set fire those who are slaves among the Gentiles. Look on those who are rejected and set free those who are slaves among the Gentiles. Look on those who are rejected and despised, and let the Gentiles know that you are our God. Punish those who oppress and who are insolent with pride. Plant your people in your holy place as Moses promised. When the priest sang the hymns, after the materials of the sacrifice had been consumed, Nehemiah ordered that the liquid that was left should be poured on large stones. When this was done, a flame blazed up, but when the light from the altar shone back, it went out. When this matter became known, and it was reported to the king of the Persians that in the place where the exiled priest had hidden the fire, the liquid had appeared with which Nehemiah and his associates had burned the materials of the sacrifice, the king investigated the matter and enclosed the place and made it sacred. And with those persons whom the king favored, he exchanged many excellent gifts. Nehemiah and his associates called this Nephtatar, which means purification, but by most people it's called Nephthalah.
Jeremiah hides the tent, ark, and altar. One finds in the records that the prophet Jeremiah ordered those who were being deported to take some of the fire, as has been mentioned, and that the prophet, after giving them the law, instructed those who were being deported not to forget the commandments of the Lord, or to be led astray in their thoughts on seeing the gold and silver statues and their adornment. And with other similar words, he exhorted them that the law should not depart from their hearts. It was also in the same document that the prophet, having received an oracle, ordered that the tent and the ark should follow with him, and that he went out to the mountain where Moses had gone and had seen the inheritance of God. Jeremiah came and found a cave dwelling, and he brought there the tent and the ark and the altar of incense. Then he sealed up the entrance. Some of those who followed him came up intending to mark the way, but could not find it. When Jeremiah learned of it, he rebuked them and declared, "The place shall remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. Then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud will appear, as they were shown in the case of Moses, and as Solomon asked that the place should be specifically consecrated." It was also made clear that being possessed of wisdom, Solomon offered sacrifice and for the dedication and implementation of the temple. Just as Moses prayed to the Lord, and fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, so also Solomon prayed, and the fire came down and consumed the whole burnt offerings. And Moses said, "They were consumed because the sin offering had not been eaten." Likewise, Solomon also kept the 8 days. The same things are reported in the records and in the memoirs of Nehemiah, and also that he founded a library and collected the books about the kings and the prophets and the writings of David and the letters of kings about Moavite offerings. In the same way, Judas also collected all the books that had been lost on the account of the war that had come upon us, and they are in our possession. So if you have need of them, send people to get them for you. Since, therefore, we are about to celebrate the purification, we write to you. Will you therefore please keep these days? It is God who has saved all of his people and has returned the inheritance to all, and the kingship and the priesthood and the consecration, as he promised through the law. We have hope in God that he will soon have mercy on us and will gather us from everywhere under heaven into this holy place, for he has rescued us from great evils and has purified the place. The compiler's preference. The story of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers and the purification of the great temple and the dedication of the altar, and further the wars against Antiochus Epiphanes and his son Epidra, and the appearances that came from heaven to those who fought bravely for Judaism, so that through few in number they seized the whole land and pursued the barbarian hordes, and regained possession of the temple famous throughout the world, and liberated the city, and reestablished the laws that were about to be abolished. While the Lord with great kindness became gracious to them, all this which has been set forth by Jason and of Cyrene in 5 volumes, we shall attempt to condense into one book. For considering the flood of statistics involved in the difficulties there is for those who wish to enter upon the narratives of history because of the mass of material, we have aimed to please those who wish to read, make it easy for those who are inclined to memorize, and to profit all readers. For us who have undertaken the toil of abbreviating, it is no light matter, but calls for sweat and loss of sleep. Just as it is not easy for one who prepares a banquet and seeks to benefit of others, nevertheless, to secure the gratitude of many, we will gladly endure the uncomfortable toil, leaving the responsibility for exact details to the compiler, while devoting our efforts to arriving at the outlines of the condensation. For as the master builder of a new house must be concerned with the whole construction, while the one who undertakes its painting and decorating has to consider only what is suitable for its adornment. In my judgment, in this case with us, it is the duty of the original historian to occupy the ground, to discuss matters from every side, and to take trouble with details. But the one who recasts the narrative should be allowed to strive for brevity and of expression, and to forego exhaustive treatments. At this point, therefore, let us begin our narrative without adding any more to what has already been said, for it would be foolish to lengthen the preface while cutting short the history itself.
Chapter 4, Jason's Reforms. When Seleucus died and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption, promising the king at an interview 360 talents of silver, and from another source of revenue, 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it, and to enroll the people of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. When the king ascended and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his compatriots over to the Greek way of life. He set aside the existing royal concessions to the Jews, secured through John, the father of Eponymus, who went on the mission to establish friendship and alliance with the Romans, and he destroyed the lawful ways of living and introduced new customs contrary to the law. He took delight in establishing a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. There was such an extreme of Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no true high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the signal for the discus throwing, disdaining the honors prized by their ancestors and putting the highest value upon Greek forms of prestige. For this reason, heavy disaster overtook them, and those ways of living they admired and wished to imitate completely became their enemies and punished them. It is no light thing to show irreverence to the divine laws, a fact that later events will make clear. Jason introduces Greek customs. When the quadrennial games were being held in Tyre and the king was present, the vile Jason sent envoys, chosen as being Antiochian citizens from Jerusalem, to carry 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. Those who carried the money, however, thought best not to use it for sacrifice, because that was inappropriate, but to expend it for another purpose. So this money was intended by the sender for the sacrifice to Hercules, but by the decision of its carriers, it was applied to the construction of warships.
At this time, Antiochus made his second invasion of Egypt. And it happened that for almost 40 days there appeared over all the city golden-clad cavalry charging through the air, in companies fully armed with lances and drawn swords, troops of cavalry drawn up, attacks and counterattacks made on this side and on that, brandishing of shields, massing of spears, hurling of missiles, the flash of golden trappings, and armor of all kinds. Therefore, everyone prayed that the apparition might prove to have been a good omen. When a false rumor arose that Antiochus was dead, Jason took no fewer than 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault on Jerusalem. When the troops on the wall had been forced back and the last of the city was being taken, Melanius took refuge in the citadel. But Jason kept relentlessly slaughtering his compatriots, not realizing that success at the cost of one's kindred is the greatest misfortune, but imagining that he was setting up trophies of victory over enemies and not over compatriots. He did not, however, gain control of the government. In the end, he got only disgrace from his conspiracy and fled again into the country of the Ammonites. Finally, he met a miserable end. Accursed before Aretas, the ruler of the Arabs, fleeing from city to city, pursued by everyone, hated as a rebel against the laws, and abhorred as the executioner of his country and his compatriots, he was cast ashore in Egypt. There he, who had driven many from their own country into exile, died in exile, having embarked to go to the Spartans in hope of finding protection because of their kinship. He who had cast out many to lie unburied had no one to mourn for him. He had no funeral of any sort and no place in the tomb of his ancestors. When the news of what happened reached the king, he took it to mean that Judea was in revolt. So raging inwardly, he left Egypt and took the city by storm. He commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to kill those who went into their houses. Then there was a massacre of young and old, destructions of boy, women, children, and the slaughter of young girls and infants. Within the total of 3 days, 80,000 were destroyed, 40,000 in hand-to-hand fighting, and as many were sold into slavery as were killed. Not content with this, Antiochus dared to enter the most holy temple in all the world, guided by Millennius, who had become a traitor both to the laws and to his country. He took the holy vessels with his polluted hands and swept away with profane hands the votive offerings that other kings had made to enhance the glory and honor of the place. Antiochus was elated in spirit and did not perceive that the Lord was angered for a little while because of the sins of those who lived in the city, and that this was the reason he was disregarding the holy place. But if it had not happened that they were involved in many sins, this man would have been flogged and turned back from his rash act as soon as he came forward, just as Helodotus had been, whom King Seleucus sent to inspect a treasury. But the Lord did not choose the nation for the sake of the holy place, but the place for the sake of the nation. Therefore, the place itself shared in the misfortunes that befell the nation, and afterwards participated in its benefits. And what was forsaken in the wrath of the Almighty was restored again in all its glory when the great Lord became reconciled. So Antiochus carried off 1,800 talents from the temple and hurried away to Antioch, thinking in his arrogance that he could sail on the land and walk on the sea, because his mind was elated. He left governors to oppress the people. At Jerusalem, Philip, by birth a Phrygian, and in character more barbarous than the man who had appointed him, and at Gezerim, Androstus, and besides these, malicious, who lorded it over his compatriots worse than the others did. In his malice towards Jewish citizens, Antiochus sent Apollonius, the captain of the Mysians, with an army of 22,000, and commanded him to kill all the grown men and to sell the women and boys as slaves. When this man arrived in Jerusalem, he pretended to be peacefully disposed and waited until the holy Sabbath day. Then, finding the Jews not at work, he ordered his troops to parade under arms. He put to the sword all those who came out to see them, then rushed into the city with his armed warriors and killed great numbers of people. But Judas Maccabeus, with about 9 others, got away to the wilderness and kept himself and his companions alive in the mountains as wild animals do. They continued to live on what grew wild, so that they may not share in the defilement.
Chapter 6. Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and no longer to live by the laws of God. Also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers, as did the people who lived in that place. Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil. For the temple was filled with debauchery and reviling by Gentiles, who dealt with the prostitutes and had relations with women within the sacred precincts, and besides brought in things for sacrifice that were unfit. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. People could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the festivals of their ancestors, nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews. On the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews were taken under bitter constraint to partake of the sacrifices, and when a festival of Dionysus was celebrated, they were compelled to wear wreaths of ivy and to walk in the procession in honor of Dionysus. At the suggestion of the people of Ptolemais, a decree was issued to the neighboring Greek cities, and that they should adopt the same policy toward Jews and make them partake of the sacrifices. and should kill those who did not choose to change over to the Greek customs. One could see, therefore, the misery that had come upon them. For example, 2 women were brought in for having circumcised their children. They publicly paraded them around the city with their babies hanging at their breasts, and then hurled them down headlong from the wall. Others who were assembled in the caves nearby in order to observe the Sabbath day secretly were betrayed to Philip and were all burned together because their piety kept them from defending themselves in view of their regard for the most holy day. Now I urge those who read this book not to be depressed by such calamities, but to recognize that these punishments were designed not to destroy, but to discipline our people. In fact, it is a sign of great kindness not to let the impious alone for long, but to punish them immediately. For in the case of our nation, other nations, the Lord waits patiently to punish them until they have reached the full measure of their sins. But he does not deal in this way with us, in order that he may not take vengeance on us afterwards when our sins have reached their height. Therefore, he never withdraws his mercy from us. Although he disciplines us with calamities, he does not forsake his own people. Let what we have said serve as a reminder. We must go on briefly with the story. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age and of noble presence, was being forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the flesh, as all ought to go who have the courage to refuse things that is not right to taste, even for the natural love of life. Those who were in charge of that unlawful sacrifice took the man aside because of their long acquaintance with him, and privately urged him to bring meat of his own providing, proper for him to use, and pretend that he was eating the flesh of the sacrificial meal that had been commanded by the king, so that by doing this he might be saved from death and be treated kindly on account of his old friendship with them. But making a high resolve, worthy of his years and dignity of his old age, and the gray hairs that he had reached with distinction, and his excellent life even from childhood, and moreover, according to the holy God-given law, he declared himself quickly, telling them to send him to Hades. Such pretense is not worthy of our time of life, he said. For many of the young might suppose that Eleazar in his 90th year had gone over to an alien religion. And through my pretense, for the sake of living a brief moment longer, they would be led astray because of me, while I defile and disgrace my own age. Even if for the present I would avoid the punishment of mortals, yet whether I live or die, I will not escape the hands of the Almighty. Therefore, by bravely giving up my own life now, I will show myself worthy of my old age, and leave to the young a noble example of how to die, a good death, willingly and nobly for the reward of the holy laws. When he had said this, he went at once to the rack. Those who a little before had acted toward him with goodwill now changed to ill will, because the words he had uttered were, in their opinion, sheer madness. When he was about to die under the blows, he groaned aloud and said, "It is clear to the Lord in his holy knowledge that, though I might have been saved from death, I am enduring terrible suffering in my own body under this beating. But in my soul I am glad to suffer these things because I fear him." So in this way he died, leaving in his death an example of nobility and of moral courage, not only to the young, but to the great body of his nation.
The revolt of Judas Maccabeus. Meanwhile, Judas, who is also called Maccabeus or the Hammer, and his companions secretly entered the villages and summoned their kindred enlist those who had continued in the Jewish faith. So they gathered about 6,000, and they implored in the Lord to look upon the people who were impressed by all and have pity on the temple that had been profaned by the godless, to have mercy on the city that was being destroyed and about to be leveled to the ground, and the heart can to the blood that carried out to him. And remember also the lawless destruction of the innocent babies and blasphemous committed against his name, and to show his hatred of evil. As soon as Maccabeus got his army organized and the Gentiles would not withstand him, the wrath of the Lord had turned into mercy. Coming without warning, he would set fire to the towns and villages. He captured strategic positions and would fight and put to fight not a few of the enemy. And he found the nights most advantageous for such attacks, and talk of his valor spread everywhere. When Philip saw such a man gaining ground little by little, he was and that he was pushing ahead with more frequent success, he wrote to Ptolemy, the governor of Caesarea and Phoenicia, to come to aid in the king's government. The Ptolemy promoted and anointed Nicanor, son of Patroclus, one of the king's chief friends, and sent him in command with no fewer than 20,000 Gentiles of all the nations to wipe out the whole race of Judea, and associated with him Gorgias, the general of a man of experience in military service. Nicanor determined to make up for the king's tribute due to the Romans in 2,000 talents. Selling the captured Jews into slavery, he immediately sent to the towns of the seacoast, inviting them to buy Jewish slaves and promising to hand over 90 slaves for a talent, not expecting the judgment of the Almighty that was about to overtake him. What does that say?
Word. Just move word.
Okay. Word came to Judas concerning Nicanor's invasion, and when he told his companions of the arrival of the army, those who were cowardly and distrustful of God's justice ran off and got away. Others sold all the remaining property for the same implored the Lord's rescue had been sold by the ungodly Nicanor before he ever met, and it was if not for their own sake, but then the sake of the covenants made the ancestors, and because he called them by his holy and glorious name. But the Maccabeus gathered his forces together, to the number 6,000, and exhorted them not to be frightened by the enemy, and not to fear the great multitude of the Gentiles who were wickedly coming against them, but to fight nobly and keep before their eyes the lawless outrage of the Gentiles had committed against the holy place, and torture of the derided city, besides the overthrow of their ancestral way of life, for they trust to arms and acts of daring. He said, but we trust in the Almighty God, who is able with a single nod to strike down those who are coming against us, even if necessary is the whole world. Moreover, he told the occasions when came to their ancestors how in the time of Sennacherib, when 185,000 perished, and the time of battle against the Galatians that took place in Babylonia, when 8,000 Jews fought alongside 4,000 Macedonians, and yet when the Macedonians were hardly pressed, 8,000 by the help came from heaven, destroyed 120,000 Galatians, and took a great amount of booty.
With these words, he filled them with courage and made them ready to die for their laws and for their country. And he divided his army into 4 pairs and appointed his brothers also, Simon and Joseph and Jonathan, each to command a division, putting 1,500 men under each. Besides, he appointed Eleazar to read aloud from the holy book and gave the watchword, the help of God. Then, leading the first division himself, he joined battle with Nicanor. With the Almighty as their ally, they killed more than 9,000 of the enemy and wounded and disabled most of Nicanor's army, forcing them all to flee. They captured the money of those who had come to buy them as slaves. After pursuing them for a distance, they were obliged to return because the hour was late. It was the day before the Sabbath, and for that reason, they did not continue their pursuit. When they had collected the weapons of the enemy and stripped them of their spoils, they kept the Sabbath, giving great praise and thanks to the Lord who had preserved them for that day and had allotted it to them as the beginning of mercy. After the Sabbath, they gave some of the spoils to those who had been tortured and to the widows and the orphans, and distributed the rest among themselves and their children. When they had done this, they made common supplication and implored the merciful Lord to be wholly reconciled with his servants. In encounters with the forces of Timothy and Bacchides, they killed more than 20,000 of them and got possession of some exceedingly high strongholds. They divided a very large amount of plunder, giving to those who had been tortured, to the orphans and widows, and also to the aged, shares equal to their own. They collected the arms of the enemy and carefully stored them in strategic places, and more of the rest of the spoils they carried to Jerusalem. They killed the commander of Timothy's forces, a most wicked man, and one who had greatly troubled the Jews. While they were celebrating the victory in the city of their ancestors, they burned those who had set fire to the sacred gates. Callisthenes and some others who had fled into one little house, and so these received proper reward for their impiety. The thrice cursed Nicanor, who had brought the 1,000 merchants to buy the Jews, having been humbled with the help of the Lord by opponents whom he regarded as of the least account, took off his splendid uniform and made his way alone, like a runaway slave, across the country until he reached Antioch, having succeeded chiefly in the destruction of his own army. So he had undertaken to secure tribute for the Romans for the capture of the people of Jerusalem, proclaimed that the Jews had a defender, and therefore the Jews were invulnerable because they had followed the laws ordained by him. Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple and the city. They tore down the altars that had been put in the public square by the foreigners and destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices after a lapse of 2 years, and they offered incense and lighted lamps and set out the bread of the presence. And when they had done this, they fell prostrate and implored the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, but that if they should ever sin, they might be disciplined by him with forbearance and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened on the same place on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners. The purification of the sanctuary took place, that is, on the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev. They celebrated it for 8 days, rejoicing in the manner of the Festival of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Festival of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, also of fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place, and they decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Here ends the reading from the holy second book of Maccabees. Give everybody a hand that read. There's some words in there that are there's like some $5 words and there's some $25 words. I tried to remove the $25 words and it's like, you wouldn't even want to know what the word for Spartan was. So it's like, well, we have this story, and it's we kind of gave a little bit of background of what had been done. We as Israel, we constantly have sinned, and God has disciplined us. He has he keeps calling us back to Him, to faithfulness in Him. He is always faithful to us, but we are also faithless at times. The story of Hanukkah is a story, and I'm going to encourage you to read it again. There's so much there, and there were portions that we didn't take the time to read. But this was kind of the meat of the gist of it was we sinned and God disciplined us. And when we had repented, God allowed us to have victory. And then He restored purity and worship. And so this is something, did you notice anything unusual about the 8 days of Hanukkah that maybe you didn't know before? How was it celebrated in ancient times? Yeah, palm branches, which we would generally think of during what? Sukkot. And what else did they do? They had sukkahs. Right? So the word booths is a common word for tabernacles or for Sukkot or sukkahs, the tent, the temporary dwelling. So literally it's almost like a second Sukkot, celebrated and worshiped. Now we don't have the luxury for the most part of being able to do that in our days, but we remember and celebrate each day of this feast, hearkening back to a time in which God had restored us. What was defiled and profaned? Okay, so the temple in Jerusalem. The enemy just didn't capture it. What did he do to it? How did he profane it? There was a couple things. I don't think it actually mentioned. Well, actually, it did. It mentioned two things that profaned.
Yeah, profane sacrifices.
Okay, profane sacrifices that were not allowable.
They defiled the oil and the things that the priest had set up for the temple use.
Okay, so they defiled the oil and the implements. There was another big thing. Yep, the statue of Zeus. That's right. And from what I remember, the statue wasn't inside of the temple, but it was on the outside of the temple. But it was kind of like you think of it like in the courtyard just in front of the actual. Rabbis have different opinions on that, as they do with most things. But the point is that an image was erected in the temple in a place that was to be without image, an imitation of something. What was the god of that was named after that statue? Or the statue that was named after the god? Zeus. He was the highest of the gods of the Greeks. So they caused the people to try to absorb and adopt the customs of the people, which were defiling to both the body and the spirit. A gymnasium is not like us going to the gym and pumping iron right now. It was a place in which there were athletic events that were actually conducted in the nude. Because the Greeks idolized the body and they worshipped it. And this is the constant story of our race. We constantly want to be worshipped, don't we? We want to worship this form. And we see this unfortunately characterized today in celebrity worship. There's so much that we're in war at right now, but we may be like the frog in the pan, and the water's been turned up, and we don't know we're in boiling water. To be mindful of that which we participate even in today. See, this isn't an ancient story that's just history. It's a warning and a pattern for you and I to follow today. Will we be like Eleazar, and we will not defile ourselves with the things of this world? We're not talking about food. We've moved beyond that. It isn't about food anymore. It is about the defilement of the image of God that He's given to us. There's another story which we didn't take the time to it, but it was the story of Hannah. If you were to go online and find this, you'll be able to read the story of Hannah. She had 7 sons, and each of them were commanded by the king to defile themselves, and they would not. And so this mother watched a child die in front of her 7 times. And she encouraged them to not compromise until finally she was given the last opportunity. And she said, I will not compromise. And she herself was slain. And they're looked at and are counted among the martyrs of our fathers and mothers because they would not sacrifice and bow to the customs and the things of this world. So this story of an ancient time, which is a celebration, the 8 days of the oil burning for 8 days, you won't find that actually in any of the books of the Maccabees. It's a tradition that's passed down through the rabbis. Did it happen? Did it not happen? I don't know. But regardless of that, we find record of this feast being kept for 8 days. And so what better way for us to be able to honor God is to be able to participate in that. And each night if you're able to light the menorah, Baruch Hashem, but you have placed yourself in an ancient stream that goes back to an ancient time. There's a coming time in which this model will be played out once again in Jerusalem. Anybody think of that time in the future? Yep. Mm-hmm. There's a coming time where the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. How will that temple be? What will be the catalyst for that temple to be built? What's that? Yep. There will be a man who we commonly call, because we don't have a name, but we have a job description, called the Antichrist. He will follow the pattern of Antiochus in some ways. In some ways, he'll be even more convincing. He will be very subtle. We won't even know what he is, who he is. But he will be, perhaps behind the scenes, will be that which causes the temple to be rebuilt. Once the temple is rebuilt, what do the scriptures tell us that he will do? By doing what? Mm-hmm. He'll basically come into the temple, being an image. Perhaps there will be an actual statue. I don't know, but he himself is a human image, and he will sit in the temple, and he will say what? Epiphaneus. God has appeared. And so this man who comes in the future will be like this that we have read. And can you think of another time in which we were told to bow down to an image? Do you remember that? Nebuchadnezzar? Yep. Yeah. And at that time, the prophet Daniel and the 3 holy young men said, no, we will not compromise. You can kill us. You can do whatever you want to us, but we will not compromise. Many martyrs have gone to whatever it is that they endured, saying, God has been faithful to me. How can I be unfaithful to him? It's really important for you and I to be mindful of these things so that we will have an answer if we are placed in that position. Because our brothers and sisters all over the world right now are being asked these questions, and some of them are dying for the faith. It's sobering, but it is something to be conscious of, because he tells us to be sober-minded, to be alert and awake, not to be asleep. Amen? So, this is, again, I wanted to be able to take this time to be able to, thank you, to be able to go through that, and I encourage you to reread it, meditate on what happened, and see if you see any similarities to our times today. If you have children, you can skip some of the more gory parts, but try to impress them, even on young ones, what it means to love God. And so that they can be growing up in this understanding that, that their faith in God, and we have our faith in the God of Israel through Jesus, through Yeshua, that this is everything. Everything will pass away. There will be nothing else. At the end of our life, we don't take any stuff with us. We don't take any books. Wish I could take a few books, but we can't. We can only take our faith and that which has been constructed within us inside of this heart that we all carry. Amen. Father, we ask that you would impress these things upon our minds and our hearts. Lord, that we would be those that are, while the time is is here, and that our minds are clear as you give us light to be able to understand these things, Father, that we hold tightly to your truth and to your faith. Lord, that we don't allow the drudgery of the everyday to numb us. We don't allow the cares of this world to overwhelm us, but we hold tightly to the feet of Yeshua, the feet of Messiah, Lord, that because he is salvation, he is truth, life, and hope. We love you, we praise you. We just ask that you would, again, be with us today, and as we celebrate tonight as a community, Lord, I pray that you walk among us, that you would pray with us, you would laugh with us, that you would just be present in our community in such a special way. We love you, we praise you, and thank you. In Yeshua's name we ask. Amen.